Okay, we are live right now. Okay. Um, uh, Welcome to everyone who is actually joining Swakan on Liberty and Character with Larry Reid from Foundation for Economic Education. And this session is very, very special to us people at Swatantrata, me, Ravi, Saugandhi, and other people, Anas. We are all actually have a very strong connection with character and why personal character is very, very important. And Larry is actually one of the top voices in the libertarian movement, or in general also. He's the top voices who is actually pressing importance of character in terms of in life and also in the liberty movement. And my first experience with character actually started with my father, very long back when he was actually pushing me towards achieving my goals. And he actually told something very, very important. So if you actually reach your goal, you will be a successful person. And most people actually admire at that point of time. But how you reach that goal actually defines who you are and what kind of character you actually build, how you reach that one. That was the first time when I actually connect with character. And later, after a few years later, I actually come across Lawrence Reid and also his books and his talks, where he actually trying to promote character, importance of character as a central piece in the liberty movement. Then I was actually trying to reflect myself. Am I actually able to lead such a kind of life with a great character? And I have some regrets. And then from that day, I actually every day, I'm trying to improve my character better each and every day. So, so without further delay, I will tell you, I think for most of the libertarian people, Larry doesn't require any introduction, but I just gonna give a formal introduction. So Lawrence W. Reid is actually FEE President Emeritus, and he actually served FEE as a president from 2008 to 2019. But before that, he actually served as a board of trustee for the FEE, and also he actually served as an advisor for many, many libertarian organizations, including Students for Liberty, who's actually co-organizer, co-host of this conference. And he has a very interesting life. He actually led McKenna Center, which is actually one of the leading Michigan-based public policy think tank that impacting lives in Michigan state policy. And he was actually worked as a journalist. He got a chance to travel across the world and explore different kind of cultures, a different way of understanding of life. And one of the most admiring thing from the Larry is his respect for the other cultures, and whether he is actually accept or not, he actually deeply respect other people, other cultures, other ways of life. That is formal one, and there is many more things. And but without any further delay, I would like to call Larry to deliver his talk on liberty and character, why liberty as a philosophy of life is very, very important for libertarians and also in general for all the people. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Venkatesh. And also a special thanks to the center and to Students for Liberty and to all of you from India, Nepal, and wherever you may be from for taking the time to listen to this talk today. I really appreciate it. And what a wonderful introduction, Venkatesh, and I appreciate that very deeply. I feel a great, I guess the word would be kinship, friendship with India and Indians, because I have so many good friends there. But it is one of the countries I have yet to visit. I've been to, I think, 86 countries, but very high on my list is India. and Nepal and that region of the world that I have not yet been to. So one of these days, I hope to see you all. Thank you in person for the good work that you're doing on behalf of liberty. Well, my topic, as Venkatesh said, is liberty and character. And because of the nature of this audience, I don't think I need to spend much time talking about what liberty is. I just will give you a very broad explanation of that at the beginning and focus most of my attention on the other part of the equation, and that is character. But liberty is an environment, you might say. It's an environment in which each individual makes his or her own choices in life without intimidation or the initiation of force against him by others. Let me repeat that. Liberty is an environment in which each individual makes his or her own choices in life without intimidation or the initiation of force against him by others. In other words, as long as you don't initiate force against another person, liberty means then that you are left alone to govern your life, to develop associations of your choosing, to invent, to innovate, to create, to engage in peaceful trade, and to express yourself freely. The institutions that I think we commonly associate with liberty, institutions that you really have to have in place in order for liberty to be secure, are things like private property, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, the rule of law, as opposed to the governance by the whims of those in power, entrepreneurship. And if there is to be a government, one of the important institutions for liberty is a representative government based upon things like the separation of powers, or checks and balances, restrictions on the concentration of political power, protection of individual rights, and limited functions for government aimed at keeping the peace. That's what liberty means to me. And it is so precious, so rare in history that we really need to spend so much more time in awe of it and understanding why it's so important, why it makes such a difference in the lives of people when they have it. But it is very rare in history. Most of the people who have ever lived on this planet have lived not in liberty, but in some kind of serfdom or slavery, or in a system where they have to be in constant fear of those in political power, because they have so much power that if you say or do something that the people in power may object to, they can snuff you out or shut you up. That's the way most people have lived. So those who have a significant degree of liberty have been very fortunate and very rare in history. And once you lose it, it's very difficult usually to ever get it back. Sometimes it takes generations to secure it again. The world is full of people, always has been, who would be happy to deprive you of your liberty, take that environment I described away from you, if you give them that opportunity. The lust for power burns very strongly in the hearts of so many human beings that we have to be constantly on guard to protect the liberties that we have and to enhance those liberties and to make sure that other people enjoy liberty as well. Now, I'll define character and focus my attention on that in just a moment. But let me start in by saying, or asking this question: what are the main arguments for liberty? I've sort of implied so far that it's, actually I've more than just implied, I've said it pretty plainly, that liberty is very important. Well, what are the arguments for it? Why have it? I mean, why wouldn't the absence of it be a better way to run society? Aren't there people who would know better for society than the people themselves? Why is liberty so important? Well, there are several arguments. And I'll touch on 3 or 4 and then get to the one that I want to focus my attention on, which is based on character. One of the arguments for liberty is a kind of abundance argument. The argument that, well, you should support liberty because the end result of it is that people produce more things. They live at higher standards of living. That liberty means people will invent and create, become entrepreneurs, solve problems, increase production, make for a better standard of life in a purely material and economic sense. That's a pretty powerful argument because most people want to live better. They want to be better off themselves, and they want to see their families prosper and their neighbors. Most people feel that way. And when you look around the world, you'll find a strong correlation between the degree of liberty that a people have and the degree of prosperity that they enjoy. As you may know, there are indexes, 2 in particular, that each year try to put a measurement on the degree of liberty and draw some implications of that and show its connection to the material prosperity of people. One of them is the Economic Freedom of the World Index, produced by the Fraser Institute in Vancouver, Canada. The other is the Index of Economic Freedom, produced by the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. And both of these indexes, although they have their own methodologies, nonetheless, they pretty strongly show that the greater the degree of economic liberty, the more prosperous a people will be, the more they will produce, the more they will solve the problems of poverty. So that's a powerful argument, and it's a strongly empirical one, but you can dig a little bit behind it and realize that it really stands to reason that people who are free to produce will then produce. If they're not free to produce, if they're told at every turn what to do and what to charge for it and where they can sell it and whether or not they can even make it in the first place, then chances are they're not going to be as productive. So that is a powerful argument. But if you make that argument alone with, say, a skeptic, someone who's skeptical of liberty, if you tell them they should support liberty for this one reason alone, you may make some converts, but then they will be vulnerable to the first person who comes along later and says, well, even if that's true, it's not fair. Because the environment you've just described of liberty produces things like economic inequality. And therefore, we have to put wise people in charge to make sure that the goods that are produced will end up in the right pockets. We have to give political power to certain wise and compassionate people so that they can take and redistribute or plan the economy or make sure that the government owns the means of production, or fill in the blank various reasons for government dominance of an economy. So you need more than just this first argument. The argument from abundance lacks, to a significant degree, it lacks a moral component. So, and it may not be a sustainable argument because, again, somebody will come along and say fairness is more important. And I think what you've described, this economic liberty system, is not fair. So you need more arguments. A second argument that's often presented, I think it's important too, is that with liberty, you have a better chance than you'd have under any other arrangement for things like happiness and peace. That's important to most people, or it ought to be. I mean, what's the purpose of life if not to be happy and to be peaceful and to engage with each other in ways that make us both better off, make us all better off. And this stands to reason too. When people are left alone, as long as they do no harm to others, they tend to sort of go in directions that their spirit leads them, that their talents would take them, that their desires and ambitions and their choices will take them. And that tends to comport with personal happiness. The more you are in charge of your life, the more chances you'll make decisions that will leave you happier than if somebody else made them for you. And if all of us practice those kinds of basic ethical rules, we're also likely to promote peace in the process. If we're all respectful of each other, seeking not only our personal happiness, but the happiness of others, and certainly happiness of ourselves without doing so at the expense of others, well, that tends to be a very positive thing. Liberty tends to produce happiness and peace. Now, we're not perfect, so humans will always manage to screw some things up. But if you think that liberty sometimes leads us astray to unhappiness or to conflict, just imagine what the concentration of political power can do. Just look throughout history at what it has done. It is perhaps the greatest enemy of happiness and peace. So I think this is another important argument for liberty. It tends to promote happiness and peace. Another argument is that we should have liberty because that's the way we are made. I mean, just think of it. If you came from another planet, a different species of creature, and you observed human beings from afar, from orbiting around the Earth, and you had to report back to your superiors on your planet as to what you found, what the characteristics were of these creatures on Earth, I think one of the first things you would say is, wow, I haven't found any two of them identical. They're all different, every single one, and there's billions of them. And I can't find any two exactly alike. And in fact, there's every reason to believe that no two people who have ever lived on this earth have been precisely the same. That tells you something about how precious life is. When you lose one, you've lost something that is not going to be replicated. You've lost something irretrievably because we're not robots. We're not just blobs of protoplasm that some wise planner can plan and push around and mold and shape as he or she wants us to be. We are, each of us, unique creatures, very unique. And that to me suggests that, wow, then in order for you to be who you are, to be the unique creature, unique being that you are and were created to be, you have to enjoy substantial liberty. If you don't have liberty, well, then you can't be you. If you, in the absence of liberty, that means that somebody else is living their lives and their choices through you. And then we should say, well, why do they get to do that? Why can't I do that to them? What makes them so special? Why do they get to be the slave master and I have to be the slave? Aren't we all unique and different? What gives this other guy the right to claim superiority over me to the point where he can dictate every aspect of my life? So if you want to be fully human, you have to be you. You have to be the unique individual that you are. And how is that reflected? It's reflected in the choices that you make. That's what defines you. The choices, which flow, of course, from the thoughts in your mind. Your choices in the real world say a lot about what's going on inside you. These are expressions of your personality, your uniqueness, and you have to have liberty in order for that to happen. That's a powerful argument. So there are three so far. I'll give you another one, and I want to focus on the main one. Related to number three, the fourth argument is natural rights. It's sort of an extension of the argument I just gave you. The fact that we are unique, the fact that we are very special one to another, that we're not pre-programmed to be the same by some central planner, that we're given the gifts of things like free will. Well, then I think you can extrapolate from that the notion of natural rights. You come into this world, each and every one of us, each and every one of you, you come into this world with a natural right to be free, to be yourself. That's where rights come from. Rights come from the very nature of your being. Now, I wouldn't say we would have rights if we were just a bunch of robots, or if we were just clay and each of us shaped by the potter into the precise design that he has for us. I think even as a Christian, I believe this very strongly, that God certainly made us with certain parameters, but he gave us enormous amounts of individuality and the capacity for free will. Therefore, I think it's easy to extrapolate to the notion of natural rights. You have a natural right to your life, and the natural right to the property that you mix with your labor and can therefore call yours, so long as you do not deprive anyone else of the very same rights, so long as you do not, in other words, initiate force. Okay, those are the arguments most often presented by libertarians for liberty. Each one is a very powerful one. But the argument that I think we neglect too often is the argument of character. And that's what I want to discuss now. The fact that, in my estimation, liberty and character are two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. They work together. The synergy between the two is powerful and cannot be broken. If you have liberty, then you have the ability to exercise character. And it's with liberty that, in fact, we find out just how much character you have. I mean, if your life was dictated at every turn by somebody else, how would we know if you're a person of character? How would we know that? If you could only act except by the direction, by the mandate, under the coercive thumb of someone else. So when you have liberty, you have the opportunity to exercise the kind of character I'll be talking about in a few moments. And by the same token, I don't think that liberty is possible in the first place amongst a group of people who don't already possess character. I really believe that. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Character is defined a little differently depending on who's doing the defining. Sometimes we use it in different senses. In America, at least, we have a phrase when we refer to someone who's maybe quirky or whimsical or kind of eccentric. We say, oh, he's a character. And usually we say that with a smile, meaning that that person, there's something funny about him, something uniquely interesting. But you can be a character and not necessarily possess character. That's a little different sense there. And of course, you can have bad character. Somebody who's made it a lifetime to practice things like theft and aggression against other people, you would say, yeah, they have character, but it's bad character. It's disrespect for others. That's not the kind of character I'm talking about. When I refer to the connection between liberty and character, I essentially mean good character. And by that, I mean character defined by the following traits, okay? And these are not the only traits that define positive character. There are others, but these are the ones I want to talk about today. They represent a cluster of personality traits, you might say, that I think the great majority of people, maybe 99% of people, even the bad ones out there, if you press them and get them to be honest for a moment, they would say, yeah, I wish we lived in a world where more of that was practiced. These are traits that are pretty universally accepted and embraced, even by people who don't do a very good job at practicing them personally. You know, the thief, for instance, who steals from others. If you really pressed him personally and got an honest answer out of him, he'd have to say, probably would say, that, yeah, I know I steal, but I don't want people to steal from me. I wish we lived in a world where I was left alone to steal, but I don't want people doing to me what I like to do to them. So even a thief, most of them would have to say, if they're honest for a moment, that they'd like to see a world of more honest people, that they don't want to be stolen from themselves. So let's talk about some of these traits that define a strong character and therefore, I think, make it possible for a people to be free, to enjoy liberty. The connection there is very strong. I mentioned one already, but let me go into it in more detail, and that's honesty. Can you imagine a people who are dishonest, who do not put a premium on truth, who are afraid to speak truth to power, who will tell you one thing if it advantages them for the moment, but then at the drop of a hat, they'll do something else or say something different. They'll be dishonest whenever they think it gives them some short-term advantage. Can you imagine a society in which that's the way most people behave? I wouldn't want to live in such a society. I think it would be chaos. How could you take somebody's word? How could you sign a contract with them? How could you trust them? How could you shake hands and say, we've got a deal? If later they, without even caring for a moment, they decide, hey, I can get ahead if I break that contract, if I violate my word. Honesty, a commitment to the truth, a recognition that truth is valuable in and of itself, is, I think, a characteristic of a strong people. People who are dishonest, I don't think have much chance to be free. They'll be stealing from each other, lying to each other. And in that chaos, some strong man will ride in and bring order out of the chaos by beating everybody's heads together. And there go your liberties. So honesty is important. And by the way, let me tell you that if you want to be a person of influence, I think you've got to personally practice these traits like honesty. And most people will respect you for that. They'll be more likely to listen to you if they think of you as, wow, there's an honest person. And wouldn't it be great someday when you're about to leave this life to be able to look back on it and say, wow, I wasn't perfect, of course, but at least when it came to honesty, I tried my best at all times to be as truthful to my fellow man as I possibly could. Wouldn't that be a great thing to say? How many people can say that? I am so saddened when I see people late in life who still haven't understood this, who still lie, still cheat, don't put a premium on truth, think nothing of breaking their word. They usually end up being a failure in life and not much influence for good on anyone else. I sure wouldn't want to live a life like that. So honesty is important. And honest people have a chance to be free. Dishonest people probably will find themselves the subjects of someone else's dictate. Someone else will take whatever liberty they have from them because they can't be trusted. I think that liberty, in fact, is the only system. In one sense, it's not a system the way we think of systems. You know, you think of socialism, for instance, as a system because somebody has to cook it up. Somebody has to contrive it. Somebody has to scheme and draw charts and diagrams and issue mandates and orders and have all kind of networks of enforcement and spies or what have you to make it happen. But liberty doesn't require that. It just requires rule of law and honest people, basic elements of protection for individual rights and private property. And then people go about their business, and they do a lot better when they do that than if they're not free. So liberty requires that we live to high standards of character, but no other system does. That's the core of my point here about the connection between liberty and character. If you want to be free, if you want to enjoy liberty, you and lots of other people in society had better recognize the importance of personal character. Honesty is one of those elements of strong character. A second element or trait of good character and therefore of liberty is humility, intellectual humility. Now, by humility, I'm not referring, as some people think, to sort of running yourself down, say shortchanging yourself. I don't mean that, nor do I mean bragging about yourself. Of course, it's the opposite of humility. What I mean by humility is the recognition that as much as you may know, there is still a universe of knowledge out there that you don't know. That's intellectual humility. If you look around the world and ask yourself, where are the centers of the absence of humility? Where are people least humble? It tends to be in where governments are. Socialistic governments in particular, where you have a lot of people with power who think they know what's best for everybody else. These are not humble people. These are people who their own personal lives may be a mess, but they nonetheless think that just with political power and maybe some wise advisors, they can plan the lives of other people. Well, Leonard Read, the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education, wrote a famous essay that many of you may be familiar with, I, Pencil. The lesson of that story, as told by the pencil itself, which describes how it comes into being. The lesson of that story is that nobody in the world even knows how to make something as simple as a pencil, entirely from scratch. Now you might be thinking, what do you mean? We know how to make pencils. If somebody told you by yourself, entirely on your own, using no resources, no information, no wisdom, no guidance from anybody else, make a pencil from start, completely from scratch, by yourself, you couldn't do it. You'd have to be a logger, so you know how to get the trees that you make into the wooden part of the pencil. You'd have to know a lot about where the eraser material comes from and how to fashion it into the eraser at one end of the pencil. You'd have to know how to mine and find graphite that goes in the middle. You'd have to know how to make paint. You'd have to know how to service all the people you might employ to help you with this. But again, if you're supposed to do it entirely on your own, you can't even do that. Well, again, something as simple as a pencil is an immensely complex result of people choosing spontaneously and for reasons of self-interest to interact with each other, people who don't even know each other. So it's an amazing miracle, isn't it, that although no one person could make a pencil himself using no knowledge or skills from anyone else, pencils nonetheless are in super abundance. You have no trouble finding them, and they result not from central commands. Nobody is ordering people to make them or be shot. They just get made through the miracle of the marketplace, through such incredible spontaneous devices as the profit motive, incentive, the price system, and so forth. Well, that's related to this point about intellectual humility, because the moment somebody says to me, oh, well, an economy can't be left to the chaos of the marketplace, and we can't just leave it to people to make whimsical decisions. We need planners. We need people at the top who will know what needs to be done. I like to respond, that is the most preposterous thing I've ever heard. You don't even know how to make a pencil. What makes you think you know how to plan an economy, or that you could assemble enough people and enough information so that that small group could somehow plan an economy for hundreds of millions of other people? That's preposterous. I don't know why we don't just laugh at that whenever it even comes up. It's that ridiculous. So an intellectually humble person tends to be an introspective person. Have you ever noticed the difference? If you observe somebody who's not humble, who's constantly planning the lives of other people, who thinks that they know best, who isn't humble at all, they tend to be an unhappy person, because lots of times people that they're planning don't want to do what the plans call for. They want to live their own lives. And so these planners are constantly frustrated and exasperated and angry that the people they're planning seem to want to go in their own directions. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations put it so well when he said, in the great chessboard of human society, every piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from that which the legislature may choose to impress upon it. I'm pretty sure that's in The Wealth of Nations. It could be in his earlier book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, but in any event, that is word for word what Adam Smith wrote. Great observation. In the great chessboard of human society, every piece, in other words, every individual, has a principle of motion of his own, altogether different from that which the legislature may choose to impress upon it. Intellectual humility. If you're not humble, you don't take much time to look in yourself and say, where are my shortcomings? How can I improve? How can I be a better person? You think you're already there. But if you're humble, you realize that self-improvement is a never-ending, lifelong endeavor. So that's important. Just as honesty is, so is intellectual humility. Critically important to good character, and I think to the functioning of a free society of people who respect each other. Another characteristic of strong character is courage. Courage. You know, I am so thankful when I look at history and observe the many courageous people who have done some remarkable things. I get tired of hearing so many people praise the so-called common man. I don't know if in India or Nepal or your region of the world there, if you have that same phrase that's used so often here, but so many people are raised to think of the common man as if, oh, wow, we should put the common man on a pedestal. A common man is that we should sing praises to the common man. And my response to that is, it's the uncommon men and women, especially the courageous ones, the ones who stand out from the crowd, who aren't afraid to be different, who exercise their individuality, sometimes in very brave ways in a world that's hostile to them. They're the ones to whom we owe so much, if we have any degree of freedom in our lives today at all. The world is full of people who will take your liberty from you. And therefore, if you believe in liberty, you better muster some courage to defend it, courage to speak out on its behalf, courage to say things to those in power who don't want to hear what you have to tell them. Back on this common man stuff, if you are a parent, you're raising children. Can you imagine looking at those children when they're young and saying to them anything like this? Johnny or Betty, whatever the name may be, work hard, because then someday you can become common. Can you imagine telling a young child that, to strive to be common? I think that's child abuse. No, I think you want to tell them, strive to be uncommon in a positive and constructive way. Stand out from the crowd. Be as good as you can be at whatever you enjoy doing. Treat others not with the same respect, but even more respect than they may treat you. Be uncommon. I think that's some of the best advice a parent can give a child. Be uncommon, not common. Don't blend in with the crowd. Don't hide behind somebody else in order to avoid a confrontation when important things are at stake. So you look at history and you realize, wow, so many courageous people who spoke truth to power, on whose shoulders we stand. Courage is such an important character trait in a dangerous world, and especially in an unfree world. So there you got another one. Honesty, intellectual humility, courage, responsibility. That's another important character trait, responsibility. Can you imagine living in a world where people are largely irresponsible? What would that look like? A society of irresponsible people would be like this. You'd have people running around saying, oh, don't blame me, even though it was my fault. Or I'm going to point the finger of blame on somebody else, even though I made the mistake. Give me a bailout. You solved my problem. You owe me a living. Give me something, because I don't want to have to create it or trade for it myself. That's what an irresponsible society looks like. We'd all be ripping each other off, all expecting something else, something to come our way through the labor of others, as if we're entitled to it. We would be shunning our accountability. We would say we can make mistakes without suffering any of the consequences, or worse yet, foisting those consequences on the innocent. That's what irresponsibility would look like. I can't imagine that kind of a society being a free one. It would be chaos again. And out of chaos, historically, you get some strong man who will deprive you of your liberty and run your life. I think patience is another important character trait. So many people, they think of a worthy goal and they figure, oh, we got to get it right now. And sometimes that leads them to employ force to get it, or hire a politician to use force to get it. And sometimes, usually, in fact, the far better approach is to win people over carefully, strategically, compassionately, through persuasion and through patience. Answers don't come immediately sometimes. Results don't come immediately, but a good person, a wise person, a person of character will have the patience to bring somebody along in their way of thinking through patience and persuasiveness. Those are some of the characteristics of a free society. I could give you a lot of examples, but let me just sort of wind up with one or two quick ones before we open it to questions. Let me give you an example of honesty, because this is a very personal one that touched me a great deal. And it happened in roughly your part of the world, not too far away to the east of India, and that is in the country of Cambodia in 1989. That was 10 years after the terrible Khmer Rouge communists had been ousted by the invading Vietnamese. And in 1989, the Vietnamese were nearly complete with their withdrawal from Cambodia, about to leave the country in the hands of the Cambodians. After all those years of conflict and then brutal dictatorship by the Khmer Rouge and then occupation by the Vietnamese, by 1989, Cambodia was on the verge of attaining its independence and freedom once again. And I went to Cambodia that year, and I expected to see the Stone Age because of all the terrible hardships they'd been through. I didn't know what to expect in terms of the caliber of individual, the quality of the character of the people, but I had an experience that really touched me. Before I left for Cambodia, the local newspaper where I was living in Michigan ran a story about, local man to go to Cambodia. I was raising medical care, medicines to take, contributions from local hospitals to take with me because I knew that people there could use them. And so that made the local papers. And I got a call from a local woman who said, Mr. Reed, my church took care of some Cambodian families when they escaped the Khmer Rouge. And we had them here in our town for several years, and now they've moved on to other parts of the United States, but we stay in touch with them. I know that they have families back in Cambodia they would desperately like you to make contact with, because when they send things to them, especially if money is in the envelope, it usually doesn't get there. Would you be so kind as to take some letters with money in the envelopes to those families, if you can find them when you go to Cambodia? And I said, sure, I'll give it a try. And I was told, if there are any families that you can't find, and there were 3 or 4 I was to locate, don't come back with the money in the envelope. Just give the money to whoever you find, because there'll be plenty of people who could use it. Well, all but one of the families I was able to find and give them the letters from their loved ones with the money included. But the last envelope was for a family that was quite a ways away from where I was, from Phnom Penh. And so the night before I was to leave the country, I had this envelope with a letter and $200 in it. And I thought, oh my gosh, who am I going to give this to? There's so many people in need. Well, I decided, I had a good feeling, I would give it to a man who had provided me rides throughout town on his cyclo, like a, well, you know what a cyclo is, a 2-wheeled thing that he would pull. And he spoke enough English. We had brief conversations. I just sensed that he was a good man. And I knew he was desperately poor. So before I left, I gave him that envelope and the $200 that was in it. And I said, if you can get to this family miles away and give them this money and envelope, you can keep $50 of the 200. Well, that was like, gee, 6 months salary at that time. And then I left the country. And, most people would think, well, that's probably the end of that. I didn't know what to expect. But several months later, I got a call from that same woman who had first given me those letters. And she was all excited. She says, Mr. Reed, I have a letter here that the Cambodian family now living in Minnesota received from that family you couldn't get to in Cambodia. And let me tell you a couple paragraphs here in particular. And one of them at one point read, thank you for the $200. Now, what did that mean? That meant that that desperately poor man that I gave $200 to and told that he could keep 50 if he could get the money in the envelope to the family. He not only didn't keep the 50, he got the money there, didn't keep a penny of it. I mean, that's honesty above and beyond the call of duty, isn't it? I admire and respect that man so much that if ever I was in a situation where my life depended upon him in some way, I would gladly entrust it to him. And that's because of the honesty he displayed when in any public way, he really didn't have to. Wouldn't you love to live in a world like that? Can't you see how, if that's the way we behaved, and not only would we have a good conscience and be able to sleep at night and reflect well on our life at some day, but we would live in a world of peace. That's how important things like honesty are. So with that, I see I have gone about 40 minutes. So I hope I have, I know I haven't completed the case for the connection between liberty and character, but I hope I have said enough that perhaps we can have some good interaction with questions from you. Over to you, Venkatesh.
Thank you so much, Larry. It's always actually good to hear back. I mean, I was actually heard your sessions on liberty in person multiple times in the US, and also through your talks in the YouTube. But every time I actually hear it, it actually pushes me understanding deeper importance of character in a personal life. And I would like to go for a personal level question with respect to your life in younger age. So that connection with communist philosophy. So in India, most of the time, even though communism is actually almost disappearing, and political parties doesn't even win like a few seats in the parties, and their voice is really, really insignificant for good other people. But at the same time, people actually think that these guys are, their ideas actually very, very good. They still think it. India, I mean, like large number of people still actually think it. And you are
Yeah.
someone actually from the young age. I mean, your introduction to the liberty is actually come as trying to understand why communism is not actually good and what kind of horrors it can do. Could you explain why, how communism actually impacted the world in a way that um, people not able to actually build a better lives, and we
Yes.
actually gone back.
I think it all comes down to this, the use of force, the initiation of force. Communism, as it's been practiced since Karl Marx first talked about it, in actual practice, it means the arbitrary use of force to mold and shape other people. It is so synonymous with force that I would say that both communism and socialism require the use of force, so that if force isn't present, then it's not socialism and it's not communism. That's how important it is. I mean, after all, even under capitalism, you can practice some of the aspects of socialism that people seem sometimes to like. You know, the idea that, oh, well, we're just going to produce for the good of others, and we'll put it in a common storehouse and share it equally and so forth. You could do that under freedom. Under capitalism, you can do that as long as it's voluntary and consensual, as long as you convince other people, let's do this together. The difference between that and communism or socialism is that then you bring in the state does it, and it doesn't do it by voluntary request. It does it through the use of force. And if there's one thing we should have learned from all of history, more than any other single lesson, surely it is how evil the concentration of power can be. Lord Acton, of course, told us famously that power corrupts, and that absolute power corrupts absolutely. When you contemplate this, you have to realize that, wow, there is perhaps no other motivation in human life that is more corrupting, more brutal, more disrespectful of others, more intoxicating than the lust for power. So if somebody comes along and says to me, oh, communism is a good idea, it means things like sharing and caring and being compassionate, I say, look, you can do that without the force of the state. Why would you want to employ the state? What makes you think politicians know best? And many of them live lives that need a lot of cleaning up. What makes you think they can somehow live your life for you? So, you know, these terms mean slightly different things to different people, but it all comes down, I think, to whether you favor the initiation of force in society, or whether you respect other people enough to leave them free, except when they commit aggression against others.
Okay. I will take a question from a participant, and then I will come back to my own question. One question from Basanta, who is actually watching live. And how can a person with a character define his values in a society where the fraud become a norm and society rewards bad character and punishes the good ones?
Yeah, that's a question that even Americans increasingly have got to be asking, because there are so many bad trends taking place right now. A couple ways to respond to that. And the first one may sound a bit religious. I hope nobody takes it quite that way, or at least doesn't think of it as propagating any particular faith. But whatever your conception may be of the origins of man, whatever you may think of the creator, or if you believe there was one or is one, I think from that standpoint, surely you want to be able to say, I have lived to high standards that the creator had for me. So I want a clear conscience when it comes to what I think is going to happen someday, when I'm going to have to go before my maker and say, yeah, I didn't treat your creation like it was dirt. I actually respected the others that you created like me. Now, maybe you're not a person of faith. Okay, I grant that. That's your choice. Well, surely you have a conscience. Do you want someday to be able to look back on your life and say, yeah, it was tough at times. I lived in a society that did not largely put a premium on things like character, but I still stuck by it anyway because I knew it was right? Or do you want to say to yourself, even though I knew it was right, I abandoned it anyway, just because lots of other people did, just so I could go with the flow? Boy, if you have a conscience at all, I think that would bother you. So for the sake of your own conscience, if not also for your creator, I think you should want to live a life of high character. That means you can look your children in the eye and say, boy, it was tough in a world where people didn't think and behave the same way we did, but we knew what was right and we stuck by it. I think that's important. Who wants to be just another common man in a corrupt society? I don't want, that would bother me and my conscience for the rest of my life and beyond. So I think for those two reasons, a person should try to be the best. Ultimately, if you want to make for a better world, and I know, Basanta, you do, because you're working on it. If you just want to be effective, if you want to try to change the minds of all these other people in society that aren't supportive of things like liberty and character, you have to practice it yourself. The moment you let your standards slip, you cease to become an effective spokesperson for the values you say you represent. So you can't fight for liberty, but behave as if you think otherwise when it comes to the values that are important to liberty.
Okay, just to follow up on the same question. So what is the importance of the rule of law and institutions in terms of making society in a way behave more good, like with the character, with ideals, and more peacefully voluntary manner? What kind of role institutions and rule of law can actually play?
I think the rule of law is critical, and without it, we're in great danger. Why is it important? Well, it goes back to the fact that there is no human being that we could trust as if he were God. There is no human being who isn't flawed in some way, and probably no human being that can be trusted with total power. You can't just say, well, we'll have liberty by just putting these really good people in charge of us, and we'll just do what they tell us because they mean well. That will inevitably and usually very quickly degenerate into a terrible tyrannical situation. So the rule of law is really an invention of mankind an invention springing from the desire to be free, free from arbitrary dictates. The rule of law means that we have a justice system and certain standards by which we judge or adjudicate whether or not an accused person is actually guilty. Things like habeas corpus and the right to testimony, the right to have your the charges made apparent to you, not to be withheld or not to be held or incarcerated without the charges being revealed to you, and so forth. All those various pillars that compose the rule of law. Also within that is, how do you design the government that will govern you? In America, that means, or at least meant to our founders, that means we will disperse power. To ensure the rule of law, we have to prevent the rule of men. And we do that by establishing certain rules. Government, you can do this, but you can't do that. You have to follow this procedure. You have to respect this right. If you wrongly go after this person, he or she can come after you through a redress of grievances procedure and so forth. All the apparatuses, you might say, of small, limited, respectful government constitutes the rule of law. And the objective is to make law predictable so that you know ahead of time whether you're going to be breaking it or not, so you can make that choice, so that the implementation of law is fair and just, so it isn't discriminatory and arbitrary. Now, we're always going to fall short of perfection in that regard, but it is certainly a very worthy objective to aspire to. The rule of law where people know what the rules are, when they cross the line, and how to behave so as to maximize liberty for all of us.
Okay, thank you so much. Another question is, especially in the developing world, most number of times, capitalism, free markets, and privatization actually, people actually branded it as a very bad system. It actually, there is a lot of cronyism, which people think same as capitalism, which actually a different one, but still it branded as free market. Capitalism actually didn't do very good. It actually helped the rich become more richer in a not very honest manner, like a cronyism. So, do you think how free markets or capitalism can actually enhance personal character in these kind of situations? How do you think these ideals can actually enhance it? If so, how it can actually enhance it?
Yes, I do. In fact, that is a kind of synergistic character of the liberty character connection that I did not elaborate on, but I'm happy to right now. I think when you're free, when you cannot, for instance, use the power of government to get something at other people's expense, what effect does that have on you? Well, all of a sudden you decide, wow, I guess I have to serve others. I guess I better create something. I better offer something of value that other people will freely say, yeah, I'll take that. I'll give you this for it. And then we engage in mutually beneficial win-win trades that improves the standard of living for everybody. When I look, let's say I go into a shopping or a grocery store or shopping mall, I find all kinds of people I don't know who are saying, hey, come in here. Hey, look at this. Hey, I'll bet I can make you a deal on this. These are people who don't know me, who are aspiring to do better for themselves, and they've discovered that in a free enterprise system, they have to please me in the process. And if they're really good at what they do, they'll try to get to know me. They'll call me by name. I mean, there are always people, I see waiters in restaurants all the time that I think, oh, gee, I'd give that person a bigger tip if they were just a little bit friendlier. But, people learn over time. But at least under capitalism or free markets, as long as there are no special favors granted by government, you really have to compete freely in the marketplace with all comers, all competition, no advantages for you from the government at the expense of anybody else. All of a sudden, you have to be mindful of the customer. You have to be inventive. You got to be there first. offer it at a lower price or a higher quality. Now, of course, there'll be people who will cheat. There always are. They don't disappear when you have communism or socialism. In fact, not only do they not disappear, they usually work their way to into positions of government where they can cheat you with impunity. So you don't do away with that bad behavior, but by having a socialist arrangement. So there will be a few bad eggs all the time. But generally speaking, under capitalism and free markets, no cronyism, you have people desiring to serve others because that's the way they get ahead themselves. And that's the world I want to live in. I want people competing for my attention and my patronage.
Okay. Okay. So one question that is actually very important is actually, if you want to build a strong character, do you have to be a religious person? Because there are people who actually have, I mean, like showcased very strong character, but yet they are not actually non-religious. Is there any connection? Does it have to be religious, or non-religious people can actually show very strong character?
No, I don't think religion is a requirement at all. I think in many cases it can be extraordinarily reinforcing and very helpful. But I know people who would regard themselves as atheists who don't steal. They are honest. They treat other people with respect. They're advocates for liberty. And I say, great. If you want to talk privately about matters of faith, I'm always interested in that sort of thing. But I think you can arrive at all of those attributes of character that I talked about: honesty, responsibility, courage, patience, and so forth. You can arrive at all of those things from an empirical and logical, reason-based argument that has no connection with any spirituality or faith. I think you can. So I tend to talk about faith matters if people choose to talk about it and privately and so forth, not wear it on my sleeve. But for me, it is a very powerful and indispensable and reinforcing backdrop to the character I believe in.
Just to actually add to that one, how did you come up? How did you realize the importance of character? Because there has been, I mean, like many moral theorists who's actually like Adam Smith and some other libertarian theorists who actually push a little bit why, I mean, like a moral case for free markets and liberty, but you actually push strong personal character. How did you actually come up with that one?
I think at least subconsciously, I can think back to my childhood. I think it was important then in my upbringing. But in the first few decades of my advocacy for liberty as an adult, I didn't emphasize it like I have in perhaps the last 20 years. And that's largely because of observing people around me. The ones who seem to have the greatest impact tended to be the people with the greatest character, the greatest positive impact anyway. They tended to be the ones with the greatest character. My best friend for a long time and senior vice president at the Mackinac Center was a man named Joe Overton, who was killed in a plane crash. And he was such an inspiration. He didn't lecture about character, but he practiced it all the time. And it really had such an impact on me. You could take his word to the bank. He would not lie or even cut corners on the truth, no matter what. And I just increasingly looked up to that and thought, wow, well, that's a wonderful standard to have. He'll never regret that. So observing good people around me like that, but it goes back, I think, even my father, without ever specifically mentioning it by the word character, he practiced it. I think of him to this day as a man of solid character who taught it to me by his example so many times. So maybe it comes through the examples around you that you observe that are so important. But then the more I thought about liberty and I observed people of character, the more I thought, wow, they really go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. But that's been maybe in the last 20 years that I've made that connection as strongly as I do now.
Okay, thank you so much. I heard story of Joe multiple times, especially during the FICON that you actually mentioned about his story, very detailed. It was very very inspiring life he had, and you actually wrote a lot of books, and also a lot of articles and these aspects. One of the very very interesting book that I actually like the most is like Real Heroes, stories of compiling stories of the men who actually lead a great life. So could you tell us about the book, and also how do you define a hero? Because most of the time, our part of the world, heroes are defined. Che Guevara is a hero for many people, unfortunately.
Yes.
And these kind of people actually considered as a hero. How do you define? And could you also tell about the book?
Okay, that book, Real Heroes, is still available on Amazon, other booksellers. And actually, you can read, I think, almost every chapter as an individual article on my website, which is lawrencewreed.com, LawrenceWreed, no punctuation in there, lawrencewreed.com. There's a tab up on that main page that says Heroes. And the articles under that tab are pretty much the chapters from that book with a few others in addition. Well, to me, because I believe very strongly that people learn so much by the examples around them. I mean, they learn from textbooks too, they learn from things they read, but the power of example is so strong. I wanted to compile short pieces about great men and women in history. And I started by saying, these are all heroes. What do I mean by that? These are people who, not the kind of hero that maybe is heroic for a few moments. I respect them and I appreciate them. People like the fireman who goes into a burning building to save a child. Wow, that's heroic. They are heroes, absolutely. Wouldn't take anything from them. But I was more interested when I wrote that book in trying to find people who live heroic lives, not just heroic moments, but heroic lives. To some degree, they're heroic every day. They stand out from the crowd. They commit to the truth. They muster whatever courage is required to meet the challenges they face. They respect other people. They keep their word. They're truthful. They're patient, all the things that we talked about. And that they, in some cases, the people I wrote about weren't always like that. Some of the people in those chapters in the book were lousy, rotten people, but there came a moment in every case where they realized, I've got to clean up my act. And to me, that made them even more heroic because they weren't introspective enough to look at themselves as if they're apart from themselves and realize, wow, I don't meet very high standards. I better clean myself up. I appreciate that. People like Augustine, the great theologian and philosopher of the 5th century. I mean, he lived a very awful, chaotic, licentious lifestyle in his early years. But then there came a moment when he realized he had to change, and he did. And then he became such a powerful, positive influence. So I picked 40 people that I ran across. Everyone is a little different story as to where I first heard of them or found out about them, but who didn't have all the attention they deserved. I didn't want to pick the big names like George Washington, I mean, everybody knows those people. I wanted to pick the ones who deserve more attention than they got because I wanted to show people that you don't have to be already famous to be a person of character. You can develop it yourself. You can go from a person of no character to a person of great character through your choices. It's not something that only the other guy can do. You can do it too, and you should. So that was the point of that book, and it's gone very well. And let me put in a plug for my newest book, though. Was Jesus a Socialist? And even if you're not a Christian, it doesn't matter. I think you might like the book because it points out just historically that Jesus was a person of extraordinary character, and character was a centerpiece of his ethical teaching, and that he was not a socialist. So that's my latest book, just out within the last couple of weeks.
Thank you so much, Larry. And the next question is from Saudia. And do you agree with the absolute freedom of speech? The ideas are, would you say that for the cause of liberty, we must be intolerant of those ideas which we are actually against the liberty?
Oh, boy, that's a good question. Or another way to express it maybe is, how tolerant should we be for ideas that are against liberty? Well, let me tell you this. I can think of some really rotten, lousy, stupid things that have been written in history, destructive of liberty, but I would never ban them. What I think of as one of the worst books ever written, of course, was the Communist Manifesto. Sheer lunacy, just dripping with hatred for other people and their property, and with a fawning reverence for people with political power, and making prescriptions and prophecies that are ludicrous from the word go. Would I ban it? Of course not. I'm about as absolutist as it gets when it comes to freedom of speech, because I think the antidote to bad speech is not less of it, but rather more good speech. That's the best antidote. So I would say I can't readily think of an example, but the exceptions to freedom of speech absolutism that I might embrace are pretty few and far between. Sometimes people say, well, what about the guy who cries fire in a crowded theater when there isn't a fire? Isn't that a case where we should restrict the freedom of speech? Well, to me, I see that as a kind of violation of property rights. A person has bought a ticket from another with the understanding that he is going to peacefully enjoy a movie and allow others to do the same. And when the consequence of his behavior is that it disrupts the right of others to enjoy the film that they've contracted freely to see, he's violated their property rights and the property rights of the theater owner. So I'm not even so sure that famous example is a freedom of speech issue so much as it is a private property issue. So yeah, I'm pretty absolutist when it comes to freedom of speech. I can't think of a reason off the top of my head that I would put somebody behind bars because of something they said or wrote.
Okay. Just to follow up to the same one from the question from the participants, that is there any boundary for free market and liberty?
Are there any boundaries for the free market? Oh yeah. I would say, for instance, you should be free to create and innovate and hire and produce and start a business and trade with others. But we're going to blow the whistle on you if you use fraud or deception or theft in the process. If you draw the line, if you cross the line into violating the rights of other people, the same rights that you have and that you should respect others having, then yeah, I would say, well, we draw the line there. But that's true in any society. I would say, yeah, even under socialism, we got to have those kinds of rules. But the problem is, under socialism, the government does all those terrible things to you with impunity. But in a free society, I think you have to have those kinds of boundaries. They should be framed by the desire to ensure equal rights for each of us, to life and to property and to freedom of contract.
Okay. So I think we are coming to the conclusion, and I would one last question before we close is, it's more or less like an advice. We asking you that. So most of the time, young people, we actually face with situations that where we don't want to take certain decision, but we had to. So how we should actually deal with this kind of situation and actually keep um, uh, our I mean, like how we can actually deal these kind of difficult situation, how we can actually keep our character alive that moment.
Venkatesh, could you describe again? These are situations in which what is the case?
It's like so sometimes we need to deal with a situation where we don't want to take a certain decision. I mean, like in a certain direction,
Yes.
but we had to. There is no other alternative for that one. So
Oh,
how we can actually deal that kind of situation?
well, if you're facing a situation where you absolutely have no choice, where uh, you're being compelled to behave in a certain way that you personally have objections to, uh, I don't want to be judgmental because every person in such a situation is going to have to make a mental calculus. I don't want to go in this direction, but I'm being compelled. And then you have to start thinking of, well, what are the consequences of doing what I'm being compelled to do versus the consequences of resisting. And while I always tell people, stick by the highest standards of character at every turn, uh, I always caution that there are circumstances that are very tough, no question about it. I'll give you an example. Let's suppose a thief breaks into my home, and while I'm home, and at gunpoint he's holding me at bay while his buddy runs around grabbing whatever things of value he wants, and they're just about to leave, and they say, "Oh, do you have a television set?" And actually, I do. And so I'm thinking, do I tell them no? Maybe they'll just leave and not take it. But that would be dishonest. Or do I say, yeah, it's upstairs. Let me show you where it is. Now, I think when you're under such compulsion like that, it's very forgiving for you to say to somebody who's got you at gunpoint that, no, I don't have a television set. So I can't condemn a person who might so mislead a person who has initiated force against him. I know what I'd say. I'd say, no, I don't have a TV set, and I get out of here. And I don't think it would bother me, because when you're under compulsion, it's a little different set of circumstances. But as a general rule, be prepared throughout life, because it's going to present you with many difficult moments. Be prepared to go the extra mile on behalf of what you know is right, recognizing that there'll be times when decisions are tough and there's no clear, obvious answer, and you have to weigh the consequences that may be beyond your control. But as a general rule, keep your standards high. And also, as a general rule, you will not regret that.
Thank you so much, Larry, for joining us. It's I mean, your time is very, very valuable, and providing more than an hour to us, it actually means a lot to young organization like us. And I think this is one of the most important topics in an entire conference series of Swakan. And I would like to thank you on behalf of my whole team, and I hope people who's actually listening, joining through the live, can actually access Larry books and articles from the FEE website, which is actually fee.org. And thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much, Larry.
Hey, Venkatesh, let me just close quickly by saying thanks to you, thanks to your team at the center, and congratulations. I know you've completed 1 year now, right, since
Yes,
you
yes.
formed the center, and I'm just full of admiration for what you're trying to do. Don't give in. You're on the right side. You're committed to one of the most noble earthly goals you can have, which is that people shall be free. Don't give up. Keep your standards high. Work on your character. and you'll be amazed at how persuasive and effective you can be. Thank you all so much, and stay in touch. I'll be happy to do this again if you ever find that you can use me again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Larry. Have a good day. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, everyone who's actually joined. Have a good night.